When the new M4 iPad Pro released 2 months ago, a lot of possibilities opened up for me. At least in my mind. I saw this iPad as a foyer into a new way of computing for me. I had high hopes and plans on using this for video editing with DaVinci Resolve. The new Magic Keyboard felt like a leap forward from what we had before, now with an aluminum top panel, function keys, and a much larger trackpad. And the overall portability of this device tied in with the incredible performance it was boasting, and that new OLED display with a 1600 nit peak brightness really made me feel like this was an end-all device for me. This M4 iPad Pro seemed like a really good investment for me personally and for the channel, which is why at the time that these pre-orders went live, it was an instant purchase for me. So how has this thing stacked up 2 months later, and is this something that I would still recommend you buy? Before we go any further though, a like and a sub to the channel is always appreciated. I just want to say thank you so much for the support that you've been showing me recently. We're almost at 40,000 subscribers, and if we could hit that before the end of the year, that would be absolutely amazing. So thank you so much. So let's take a step back for a second. What exactly is an iPad? It's not that simple of a question anymore. It seems like the line that's been drawn for the last decade plus is shifting. Now, I'm 25. I don't want to say that I grew up with iPads, but they were always available in my house, and I was about 13 years old when I got the very first iPad mini. And that was my first personal iPad. At the time, they were nothing but glorified media and web browsing machines, offering essentially iOS on just a larger screen. I used it to play games and watch my favorite YouTubers at the time, and since the iPad mini, I've pretty much always had one of these things on hand. There was no keyboard and mouse support back then. There was no plan to even use the iPad to replace a desktop or laptop computer, and the only work that these things really found themselves in was in POS terminals at stores or coffee shops. It wasn't really until Apple released the M1 iPad Pro that this conversation came into play. I mean, we have desktop class performance in a tablet. Why can't we do desktop class things? Slowly, we've seen applications like LumaFusion, Final Cut for iPad, and Resolve creep into the iPad App Store, offering a taste of what pro-level computing on a tablet could look like. But are we there yet? And is the iPad really meant for it? I think that it's important to get back to the hardware and just get these specs out of the way, because on paper, this M4 iPad Pro is insanely impressive. In the base model 256 gig and 512 gig M4 iPad Pro, you're getting the 9-core M4 SoC with a boost clock of up to 4.4 GHz. You're also getting 8 gigs of RAM on both of these units, unless you decide to opt for the 1 or 2 terabyte models with 16 gigs of unified memory. Though with all that said, that comes with a hefty price increase. On paper, the M4 has a stronger single-core performance, beating out the i9 14900KS, which is a full-fat, high-end desktop prosumer chip with a maximum TDP of 320 watts. I have an i7 14700K inside of the PC right there that I use on a daily basis for video editing, and on paper, the M4 should be a lot better than that 14700K in a lot of circumstances. Now, performance aside, because I do want to touch on the use cases and my expectations I had with this iPad soon, I want to quickly go over some of the more interesting changes that Apple's made to the new iPad lineup, like the fact that in these new Pros, there's a tandem OLED display. I mentioned this briefly in the beginning, but yeah, OLED is a selling point for me, and it's something that I care heavily about. If I'm spending upwards of 1,000 Canadian dollars, I expect to have good hardware, and this device is no exception. I made a video about the iPad quite early on where I said very bluntly, this is the best display I've ever seen. And it really does hold true. This is a touchscreen 120Hz refresh rate tandem OLED display, meaning it's essentially 2 OLED panels stacked on top of each other to help with efficiency and brightness. This has allowed Apple to achieve an eye-searing 1600 nit peak brightness when viewing HDR content, but it also allows the iPad, a full 13-inch display, to retain 1000 nits in SDR. Unless you see one of these things in person, there's nothing that I can really say or do to show you how good this thing is, especially since you're viewing it through a camera, over a compressed stream, onto a display that is either a phone or an LCD monitor. The amount of contrast there is, the accuracy of the colors, the vibrancy, when viewing the correct content, this thing looks better than real life. This could be the perfect reference monitor for professional work, it could be the best display you've ever drawn on, and it could very well be the best display that you'll have in your house for the next couple of years. The only negative thing that I do have to say about this display is that the reflections stick out like a sore thumb. Granted, this is going to be the case with any glass covered panel, and Apple does make a nano textured variant of this, much like their Studio and Pro displays, but that comes with reduced contrast, at least perceived contrast. And it also comes at a heftier price since it's only available in the 1 and 2 terabyte models and is an additional charge for that etched glass. And before I see you guys typing away and getting angry at me in the comments down below, because this was a pretty big point of contention in the last video, I have actually seen in person and had hands-on with the nano texture coating and this regular coating on the iPad Pro. In my opinion, the nano texture coating does reduce a lot of contrast and makes it look more akin to something like an LCD display. That being said, it'd probably be the best LCD looking display that you've ever seen in your life. But in my opinion, it just doesn't make sense. If you're gonna spend this much money on this thing, a lot of that money is going toward the display. You might as well have the version that has the best viewing capabilities for that display. Now, a lot of you are going to chuck on a paper-like screen protector for the use of an Apple Pencil. I get it. It's something that you might need, but it hurts. It makes me dead inside. Now, aside from the physical device itself, not much has changed. And aside from the M4, there's been no real changes to the internals. We're still missing Wi-Fi 7 and millimeter wave 5G, and Apple has taken it upon themselves to remove the ultra-wide camera from the iPad. Although in its place is a new LiDAR sensor, which is supposed to help with things like document scanning and adaptive True Tone flash. Though I'd imagine that Apple has a ton of internal data from previous generations of iPad, which can justify the removal of the ultra-wide, and I imagine that professionals and people in business don't use it often. But it's still an odd thing to see a company remove a feature on a device that is this expensive. I will admit though, I'm not someone that's ever used it, and I've actually never used the cameras on my iPad except for the front facing one, which is now thankfully in the center when in the landscape position. This makes a lot more sense for video calls, meetings, and since the iPad Pros, especially the 13-inch, find their way into the landscape position more often, considering the Magic Keyboard, I'd imagine that this is a welcome change for everyone. It makes Face ID much more attentive, and it doesn't make you look like you aren't paying attention when on a business call. It just feels like something that should have honestly been done a really long time ago, but it took the base 10th gen iPad to light the fire underneath. Of course, the iPad is also much thinner and is lighter now, not only as a standalone device, but the package itself, including the Magic Keyboard, which is nice to see. And like I mentioned previously, while it being thin doesn't have any real world benefits, in fact, Apple actually shrunk the battery to do this, I think that when paired with accessories, it shrinks the overall volume significantly, enough to where it's noticeable. And I'll just touch on the battery life for a quick second because I didn't make a segment in this video about it. It's going to give you pretty much the same battery life that you've experienced with on these iPad Pros before. It's not insane. It'll definitely last you a majority of the day if you're using it nonstop, but it's something that you'll have to charge regularly. It's not going to give you this like 20-hour plus battery life that you're going to get on these new MacBooks. There just isn't enough battery in here. And while I think that it's annoying Apple shrunk this device to make the battery smaller, I mean, at the end of the day, it's not something that's actually bothered me. Okay, so now that I'm done telling you about this device, what are we looking at after 2 months? Like, how have I been able to incorporate this into my workflow, and would I recommend it? So I started off by saying that the iPad was going to be used for video editing and admin tasks and essentially make this my main workstation until I needed more screen real estate. However, this iPad has almost entirely fell short of everything that I expected to get out of it. And my expectations on the M4 iPad Pro and iPads in general have significantly been lowered because of this device. Starting with DaVinci Resolve. The actual program is fantastic, though the Fusion and editing pages need to be added through keyboard shortcuts every time that you launch it, whereas on PC, they're right there front and center as soon as you open the program up. This was done to make the iPad a little less jarring of an experience, but in return, it makes it more of an issue for people who use these programs professionally. File management on iPad is also a lot more frustrating than it is on macOS or Windows, and there is quite the learning curve. And unless you're shelling out thousands more, I mean, almost, for the 2 terabyte model, the added portability of the iPad is kind of a facade since you're gonna need some external SSDs. I've also found the performance on Resolve to be a little hit or miss on the iPad, which is weird considering how powerful the M4 seems to be, and the 13-inch size, while manageable, I found it to be quite cramped realistically to get any actual editing done. Split view though works fine for moving things like files over to another app, like messages if you're trying to send over something important, but it would be nice to have a floating window or experience a little more akin to macOS, allowing me to have specific applications like files to be popped out in a resizable window that's much more manageable, because it makes dragging and dropping specific media more of a breeze rather than a headache on the iPad. That being said though, Final Cut does now support the use of external media, which is huge considering that everything that you needed to do on Final Cut previously needed to be done on device beforehand. But I'm not a fan of Final Cut's design on iPad, almost forcing you to use the touch experience. I like editing with a keyboard and trackpad, and I find that using Final Cut really slows me down, especially since it's not or has ever been my primary editor. And considering that I use a desktop Windows computer for editing mainly, going back and forth between a program like Final Cut and Resolve is going to be really confusing, and it's just not going to work. It's not something that can really be integrated correctly at all. Speaking of split view though, this is something that I do like a lot on the iPad. It's similar to snappable windows on my PC, and I do use it all the time. Being able to have two applications side by side and a floating window for an app like Messages allows me to fill up my display with things that are useful rather than switching in and out of an app. Like when I need to reference a spec sheet to make sure I'm getting the numbers right whilst I'm writing a script, or if I want to watch YouTube while catching up with Twitter, split view makes it easy. Though the alternative to split view on the iPad, the thing that was supposed to give us the MacBook-like experience, is Stage Manager. And I'm not a fan of it at all. I don't think that Stage Manager is good at replicating a desktop experience. I think it's cumbersome and overall takes up far more screen real estate than just using something like split view. So while split view may be a little bit more limiting in a sense, it's definitely more practical for me. I was also really excited to use the new iPad Pro with the new Apple Pencil Pro, because I wanted to use it for writing down notes or planning video ideas and sketching thumbnails. And while the Pencil is mechanically really impressive with all of the new features that Apple's added, and it works really well with the iPad, I haven't used it at all. And this is on me in my ignorance because I never really needed to use it. Like, my wife is someone who used it all the time. She actually benefited from it when she was in her second university degree, and someone like my cousin who's doing her MCAT relies on her iPad and Apple Pencil exclusively for note-taking because of how much easier it is to write these things down. And it's completely moved her away from using a MacBook to type notes. But I guess that kind of leads me into the point that I'm trying to make. The M4 iPad Pro is an amazing iPad, but at the end of the day, that's all the M4 iPad Pro really is. An iPad. I know a lot of creators and professionals, and I haven't spoke to anyone yet that actually benefits from the performance of the new iPads. What this device has turned into for me is a glorified script writing machine, a teleprompter, a content consumption machine, and while I do use it every single day, and while I do thoroughly enjoy the M4 iPad Pro, I do not get any benefit out of the iPad. In fact, a device like the 14-inch M3 MacBook Pro makes a lot more sense for myself. However, there are some really niche use cases that I've found for this device that do add a little bit of value to my life. The iPad turns into a giant monitor for my FX30. This helps when setting up shots when outdoors, since I don't have a display near me to reference from, and it could be good for playing back clips to make sure that they're in focus or exposed correctly. So it's kind of an invaluable tool. When it comes to the MacBook debate though, what I get with the iPad is a much easier device to carry around and manipulate, especially if at that moment I don't need to use the Magic Keyboard, just because of how thin and light the new M4 iPad Pro is. I think that in short, if there's anything that you learned about the M4 iPad Pro in the last couple of months, it's that you don't need it. There's a ton of really good deals on refurbished iPads, and there's a new larger M2 iPad Air if you wanted to save some cost. Ultimately, you're gonna get an almost identical experience minus the display, but when it comes to apps and games or even programs like Final Cut or Resolve, I find it hard to believe that the M4 is actually giving you a better experience, at least for now. Thank you for watching this one. I really appreciate your support and you sticking by. If you've learned something valuable or if you had anything that you wanted to take away, leave a like and consider subscribing. It helps a lot. And if you've watched all the way through to the end of this video, dropping an Apple emoji in the comments below lets me know who the real ones are. And yeah, so that's been it. I hope you don't get too mad about my take on the iPad, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace out.